An unexpected inheritance, a secret from the past revealed. Santiago, the humble son of the gardener, finds himself at the center of a family battle over an empire he never imagined owning. But what no one knew was that he had a deeper connection to that legacy than anyone thought. Between betrayals, secrets, and redemption, Santiago will have to decide how to wield the power he never asked for, while facing the ghosts of a dark past and the conflicts of a family marked by greed. Prepare for a story of twists, forgiveness, and the true meaning of inheritance. Welcome to Family Lies. Before starting, please like and subscribe so we can continue creating stories like this. Santiago woke up before the alarm that morning as he always did. It was 5:42 when he opened his eyes, unhurried but with a strange feeling that something was about to happen. He sometimes had these premonitions, a restlessness in his chest, as if the air around him had grown thicker. His room was small, the furniture, old and worn but clean. He still lived in the old staff house of the Santa Amalia estate, where his father, Alvaro, had worked for over 40 years as head gardener for Mr. Raimundo de Arantes. Santiago was 27, his hands calloused, his habits quiet, his tendency to listen more than speak. He had spent most of his life among flowers, damp soil, and the comfortable silence of the greenhouses. It was a cloudy Tuesday, early autumn, with the scent of wet leaves in the air. That day, he wasn't going. To work, he'd been summoned to the family lawyer's office for a meeting about the old boss's will. The entire estate knew of Don Raimundo's death. The funeral had been 3 days prior, discreet but attended by the local elite, judges, businessmen, politicians, people who had barely set foot there in life but made sure to be seen on occasions like this. Santiago had attended in silence, wearing a clean shirt and shoes he hadn't worn since a cousin's wedding. He felt out of place among the curious glances and muffled whispers. Most of those present knew him only as the gardener's son. But there was one detail no one could ignore. Don Raimundo had always been close to Santiago. They walked the property together, talked for hours, and the old man had a habit of giving him books, asking for simple advice, inquiring about his mother. None of it had seemed important until that day, until the moment Santiago's name appeared in the official will documents. When he arrived at the EIM lawyer's office, Santiago found himself in a stuffy room, dimly lit by a weak lamp above the desk. The lawyer, a short man with thick-framed glasses, was perched over a pile of papers, clearly nervous but trying to hide it. There was no warmth in his words, nor in the reception. Santiago smelled old tobacco and cooling coffee, which made him uneasy. He didn't like bitter coffee, nor closed, airless spaces like this one. He thought about going home, but something told him it would be pointless. He was there, and he needed to know. The door was slightly ajar, and he heard the murmur of voices on the other side, in what sounded more like an argument than a discussion. Don Raimundo's family was already there. The voices were sharp and impatient, with the tone of people who already knew what the will said, and didn't like it one bit. When the door opened, the shock was immediate. At the table sat figures Santiago recognized from afar. Gerardo, Don Raimundo's nephew, his face always closed, off as if the world owed him something. Beside him, Gerardo's wife, Luisa, with her forced smile and heavy makeup, only there because she thought herself superior to everyone. It didn't take long for Santiago to notice the heavy silence hanging in the air. Everyone looked at him as if he were an intruder, someone out of place, and he felt it clearly. The others, more distant, didn't speak, but their expressions said everything. There was contained rage, an irritation that couldn't be disguised. The lawyer gestured for him to sit, but Santiago remained standing, his eyes fixed on the stack of documents waiting for him. He knew that from that moment on, his life would never be the same. The lawyer, trying to establish some order, spoke up. His voice was monotonous, as if reciting something memorized. He spoke of Don Raimundo's death and the details of the will, But Santiago couldn't focus. His mind was elsewhere, lost in the hostile stares of the family surrounding him. The hardest part was facing Gerardo, who watched him with a mix of contempt and disbelief. For the first time, Santiago noticed how uncomfortable Don Raimundo's nephew was, as if something had been taken from him, and he didn't know how to react. But the worst was yet to come. The lawyer began reading the will aloud, pausing after each sentence for emphasis, as if he wanted every word to sink in. And then, finally, what everyone had been waiting for. I, Don Raimundo de Arantes, leave all my property, wealth and possessions to Santiago, son of Alvaro, my gardener. The room fell into absolute silence. Santiago felt a wave of heat rise to his head, but at the same time something cold settled in his stomach. He tried to process what he had just heard, but the words made no sense. How could he, the simple son of a gardener, inherit all of this? He looked at the others, who were in shock, some wide-eyed, others gripping the arms of their chairs. Gerardo, for instance, was so pale he looked like he might faint. The tension in the room was almost palpable, as if the very walls were pressing in on them. Santiago felt a lump in his throat and found it hard to breathe. He tried to look away but couldn't. The anger, disdain, and confusion of Don Raimundo's family were too clear. He didn't know what to do or say. He was just there, being dragged into a reality that seemed to be constructing itself around him, one he had never asked for. Gerardo was the first to react, shattering the tense silence. His eyes, red with anger, fixed on Santiago with an almost threatening intensity. He stood abruptly, his fingers curling into fists on the table, and shouted, his voice hoarse with scorn, "This is a mistake. You are nothing. You have no right to any of this." Gerardo's tone was desperate, as if the ground had been ripped from under him. Luisa, his wife, covered her mouth, her eyes welling up, not with sadness, but astonishment, as if this were some nightmare she couldn't wake from. Santiago remained, still, feeling the weight of every word Gerardo hurled at him. He had never imagined this man, who had always looked down on him, could be so aggressive. The lawyer, trying to restore order, intervened, but the tension had spread like wildfire. Every member of Don Raimundo's family seemed in shock, but their anger was palpable. Some whispered among themselves, while others simply watched, hands nervously clasped, waiting for Santiago's reaction. He, in turn, was trying to understand what was happening inside him. He didn't know how to respond. He had never seen himself as someone who could occupy that place, someone who, in an instant, had become the owner of everything. His heart pounded faster, and cold sweat trickled down his neck. He looked at the lawyer, who seemed eager to finish reading the will. The silence in the room was suffocating, and with each passing second, Santiago felt more lost. He wanted to leave, to return to his simple life, but he knew he couldn't. The weight of the inheritance suddenly felt more like a burden than a blessing. The lawyer, visibly uncomfortable, hurried through the rest of the will. With each word, the tension grew, as if announcing the inheritance was a provocation to those present. Santiago felt a tightness in his chest, as if the air had thickened. He couldn't tell if his discomfort was physical or emotional, or both, twisted together in anguish. The next words, however, only deepened the bewilderment. I also leave to my dear niece Luisa the responsibility of caring for my home, but on one condition. The lawyer paused, looking at Gerardo and his wife. That she shares it with Santiago, to the extent that he wishes to contribute to the well-being of the property and the family. It was a blow. Santiago's stomach churned. They weren't just being stripped of their inheritance. Now they were being forced to share power with him, the gardener's son. Gerardo swallowed hard, his jaw clenched. Luisa, meanwhile, seemed on the verge of collapse. Santiago looked at the lawyer as if he could explain it all, but there were no explanations. He felt like an observer, unable to believe what was happening, yet trapped in a reality he couldn't escape. The scent of old wood and dust in the office mixed with the weight of the words, creating a suffocating atmosphere. He didn't know what to do. The truth about the will was out, and he knew his life would change from that moment on. The anger and frustration of Don Raimundo's family were palpable, but somehow he still felt detached from it all. What had he done to deserve this? He was just Alvaro's son, the gardener, nothing more. But as he looked at the lawyer, something inside him let go of doubt. That day would not be like the others. His life would never be the same. The silence that followed was broken only by the creaking of the aged wooden floor, echoing uncomfortably in the small office. Santiago felt a sudden dizziness, as if the room were spinning around him and he were about to fall. The stares of Don Raimundo's family still weighed on him, but he no longer met their eyes. His mind was racing, and he knew he couldn't sort through everything right then. That was when one of the letters on the table caught his attention, a yellowed, seemingly old letter, its wax seal broken. It didn't have his name on it, but something about its texture and the careless way it had been left there suggested it had been placed intentionally. Driven by sudden curiosity, Santiago picked it up. The words didn't make sense at first, but what he read made his stomach tighten. The letter revealed something no one, not even the lawyer, had mentioned until then. Years earlier, Don Raimundo had written about his mistake. The story of a forbidden love, of a woman who, according to the letter, was Santiago's mother. He read more carefully, his shock growing. The woman had been a former maid on the estate, a young woman named Clara, who had mysteriously disappeared many years ago after giving birth. Don Raimundo spoke of her with regret, saying he had secretly loved her, and that her son was, in some way, his true legacy. The words were clear, though filled with pain. Santiago felt the weight of the revelation crush his chest. He didn't know what to do with this information, but he knew that piece of paper changed everything. The blood running through his veins wasn't just that of a gardener, it was something much deeper. He looked at Don Raimundo's family, still in shock, but the hatred in Gerardo's eyes now seemed like a reflection of his own fear. The revelation about the letter nearly made Santiago lose control of his emotions. He stared at the paper in his hands, trying to process everything written there. Don Raimundo, so imposing, so wealthy, had kept this secret for so many years, and now it had been thrown onto Santiago's shoulders like a cloak too heavy to bear. What was he supposed to do with this? What would the family think when they found out he wasn't just the gardener's son, but the child of a woman many on the estate didn't even remember? And most importantly, what did this mean for his future? Don Raimundo's family remained silent, but their stares were now charged with a new kind of hostility. They knew the truth had been uncovered, and it changed the rules of the game, but no one dared say what it meant. The tension had reached its peak. Gerardo, breaking the silence again, could no longer contain his rage. "So that's it?" His voice was full of scorn. "Now you're going to hide behind some old letter and pretend that changes everything?" He took a step toward Santiago, his eyes narrowed, his breathing heavy. "You have no right to be here. It doesn't matter what was written. You're not one of us." Gerardo was on the verge of collapse, and Santiago realized his anger wasn't just about the inheritance anymore. It was personal. He wasn't just some poor man being ignored. He was now a real threat to Gerardo's interests. Santiago stayed quiet, not knowing how to respond, feeling pressure from all sides. He had the right, but he didn't feel capable of fighting for it. The tension in the room was unbearable. Santiago's hands were sweaty as he held the letter, as if clinging to something he couldn't control. He knew confrontation was inevitable, but he hadn't imagined it would be so direct, so fierce. Gerardo kept hurling sharp words at him, trying to destabilize him, but something in Santiago had shifted. He was no longer the same quiet, timid young man who had started working in Don Raimundo's gardens. The weight of the inheritance and the discovery of his true lineage had changed him. He felt a strange clarity, something he'd never experienced before. He didn't have to hide behind the humility that had always defined him. He could be someone, even if it was painful for everyone around him. "I have the right," he said, the words coming out firmer than he expected. His voice trembled, but he repeated it to himself. He had the right. This was Don Raimundo's wish. The silence that followed was even heavier than before. Gerardo's anger was palpable, but now there was something different. He no longer seemed so sure of himself. Luisa, watching closely, was the first to approach Santiago. Her steps were hesitant, but there was something in her gaze that couldn't be ignored. She looked confused, almost lost, as if the pieces of the puzzle were finally coming together. But she didn't know what to do with this new reality. Did you know about this?" she asked, her voice shaking. Santiago didn't know if she meant the letter or the inheritance. He shook his head, feeling the weight of the situation grow even heavier. He hadn't prepared for this moment, to be at the center of a fight he didn't want. But one thing was clear: the truth was out, and no one could ignore it. He wasn't just the gardener, the quiet assistant to his father. He was something more now, and somehow the family's resentment only reinforced that. The tension in the room had crystallized, as if time had stopped. Every word, every exchanged glance, carried more weight than usual. Santiago's hands were still sweaty, his nerves raw, but there was also a strange calm pushing him forward. He looked at Luisa, who was waiting for an answer. Her expression was a mix of pain and confusion, as if she were trying to understand if this was really happening. "I didn't know," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "But now I do." He watched her eyes narrow, surprise and suspicion taking over, but he didn't look away. He knew this wasn't just about rights or inheritance. It was something deeper. The family's rejection of a truth they could no longer deny. He hadn't done anything wrong. He hadn't chosen to be born into this situation. But now that he was here, he would have to fight for what was rightfully his. Gerardo, growing more agitated, seemed unable to process everything. "This is a mistake," he shouted again, his voice breaking. "I won't accept this." He lunged toward Santiago, but was stopped by the lawyer, who stepped between them. "Mr. Gerardo, it's been decided. The will is clear. The inheritance goes to Santiago." Gerardo's frustration was visible. His eyes were bloodshot, his fists clenched so tightly the veins in his arms bulged. "I won't let you win. I won't let this man take what's mine." His voice was hoarse with rage. The threat in his words was clear, but the strangeness in the room only grew, drawing even the nearby servants closer, trying to understand what was happening. The confrontation was escalating, the atmosphere ready to explode. Santiago felt the pressure building inside him, the air thick and hot with a conflict beyond his control. Gerardo's anger, the shouting, the hostility, it all made him want to run, to disappear somewhere far away. But he knew he couldn't. The responsibility was his now, and as terrifying as it was, there was no turning back. He looked at the letter again, as if it could guide him, give him the strength to keep going. Gerardo's presence was threatening, but there was something deeper, something in his soul telling him he had a purpose here. He couldn't let the family's bitterness consume him. That wasn't Don Raimundo's legacy. He straightened his shoulders and in a calm voice said, "I'm not your enemy, Gerardo. I'm just someone trying to understand what's been left to me." Luisa, who had been silent until then, seemed to process his words. She watched him with an intensity that made his stomach twist, but there was also a compassion he didn't know how to handle. "Santiago," she began, her voice soft, almost pleading. "I know this is hard, but—" She paused, as if searching for the right words. Don Raimundo was complicated. He had his secrets, and now they're yours to bear. Santiago felt a lump in his throat, a mix of sadness and relief. She was trying in some way to support him, but he knew complicated didn't begin to cover it. He stepped closer, not with anger but with a need for answers. "Luisa, what do you know? About my mother? About Clara?" She hesitated, but before she could answer, Gerardo cut in, shouting, "Stop it, Luisa! Don't listen to him!" Luisa didn't back down. She looked at Gerardo with a firmness Santiago hadn't expected. There was something in her expression, a decision, as if she had finally made up her mind about something she'd been avoiding. "Gerardo, enough! No more threats. This has gone too far." Gerardo stared at her in disbelief, as if he couldn't believe his sister was opposing him. She turned back to Santiago. "I don't know everything, Santiago, but what I do know is that Don Raimundo did things he never told anyone, not even me. He tried to protect what he loved, but he was a proud man. And Clara, your mother, she was one of the victims of that pride." Her words fell like stones in the silent room. Santiago didn't know how to respond. He had never imagined she would break family loyalty to speak against her brother. The shock was almost as great as the letter's revelation. The silence was broken by the lawyer, who, with a calm that didn't belong in that room, urged everyone to settle down. "This isn't the time for more shouting. We're here to settle this according to Don Raimundo's wishes, not let emotions take over." But despite his efforts, the situation was beyond control. Luisa's words echoed in Santiago's mind. The truth about Clara, his mother, made him feel something strange, not just pain, but a disconnect, as if the ground beneath him was crumbling. He didn't know what else to expect from this conversation, but he knew the truth was coming out, and it might not be what he had imagined. Gerardo, still furious, took a step back as if trying to recompose himself, but the fury in his eyes did not diminish. He looked at the lawyer, who was trying to control the situation with excessive calm. "I won't accept this. You can say whatever you want, but it won't change anything. Santiago is not one of us, and he never will be. He may have the will, but I will fight to the end to show who he really is," he said, his anger overflowing in every word. Santiago felt a chill run down his spine. This wasn't just a fight over money or power. It was a fight over identity, over belonging, and that seemed even more terrifying. He tried to stay calm, but inside, doubt gnawed at him. What if he wasn't truly worthy of this? Inheritance? What if all this conflict was, in some way, a reflection of something deeper? The feeling of being an intruder, a spectator in his own life, seized his chest, but he forced the thought away. He had the right. It didn't matter what Don Raimundo's family thought. The lawyer then raised a hand, signaling for everyone to sit. "The situation is clear. The will has been read, and Don Raimundo's inheritance belongs to Santiago," he repeated, as if reciting a formula to ensure everyone understood. "The legal process will be followed. There is nothing more to discuss." But at the same time, his presence there seemed fragile, almost ineffective against the intensity of the emotions and tensions filling the room. Santiago realized that, no matter how much they tried to follow the legal course, the family wounds ran much deeper. What was happening wasn't just a dispute over material possessions. It was a struggle for identity and recognition. The mere fact that Don Raimundo had chosen him as heir unsettled everyone, unearthing secrets, fears, and resentments buried for decades. And from that moment on, Santiago knew his life would never be the same. He looked at the lawyer, still processing the words that had been spoken. He felt their weight pressing on his shoulders, and the strangest thing was that, while he tried to grasp the magnitude of the situation, he also felt a growing fear of losing control of everything. The conflict no longer seemed centered solely on the inheritance or Don Raimundo's material wealth. It was a war of stories and places that no one fully understood, not even him. He didn't know if he was ready to carry the legacy of a man he had never called father, yet who had chosen him as heir. The sensation of being pulled into a storm seemed to grow with each passing minute. He looked at Luisa again, searching her eyes for something reassuring. But all he found was an empty expression, as if she were just as lost as he was, trying to understand how far this power struggle would take them. The first night he spent in Don Raimundo's house after the will was unbearable. Santiago was in a room that had once seemed like a simple guest bedroom, but had now become a symbol of his new reality. The bed was large, comfortable, but he could barely close his eyes. Every creak of the house, every distant noise made his body tense, as if expecting an attack. He didn't know what he would do the next day when the legal battles truly began, or what to expect from Gerardo and the family, who now looked at him with contempt. Once again, his thoughts turned to Clara. He wondered what she would have thought of all this. Had she known his true origins, or had she been kept in the dark? The uncertainty about who he really was, beyond the gardener's son, haunted him even more. But at that moment, he also knew there was no turning back. He needed to find strength, something he wasn't sure he had, but felt pressured to discover. The next morning brought the feeling of a new beginning, but also the uncertainty of a future unfolding in unexpected ways. Santiago woke early, before sunrise, as he always had when working in the gardens. But he wasn't there to tend to plants and flowers anymore. He was there to face something much greater, his identity, his inheritance, his responsibility. He walked to the window, looking out at the gardens he knew so well, yet which now seemed different. They were no longer just a workplace, but a piece of his past and Don Raimundo's legacy. He questioned how the man who had once been his employer had seen him, if he had ever seen him as something special. The weight of the decisions ahead crushed him, and he felt as if he were being watched, not just by the family, but by something even more distant and invisible. Something he couldn't define, but which seemed to urge him forward, to not yield. The lawyers began arriving shortly after breakfast. There was a whole group of them, and the number of people around Santiago grew, making him feel even more isolated. He had never imagined his once simple, humble role as a gardening assistant would place him at the center of such a fierce legal battle. He studied the faces around him, searching for sympathy or even understanding, but the eyes of his relatives were filled with distrust, as if he were an imposter, a threat to what they believed was rightfully theirs. Every word spoken by the lawyers and his family felt like another weight on his shoulders, and Santiago didn't know how much longer he could bear it. Deep down, he felt powerless, as if the world were closing in on him, and no matter how hard he tried to stand firm, the pressure was suffocating him. The weight of not being accepted, of being rejected by those who had never cared for him before, was eroding his confidence. The entire day was a whirlwind of documents, meetings, and endless arguments. Santiago tried to maintain his composure, but Gerardo's cutting words and the disdainful looks from other family members made his stomach churn. He felt constant pressure, as if walking through a minefield where any misstep could lead to disaster. That night, after hours of debates and accusations, he retreated to the garden. The sky was dark, the only light coming from the moon, softly illuminating the path he walked. He stopped near a tree Don Raimundo had planted with him years ago and stood there, watching the shadows of leaves swaying in the wind. The feeling of being lost intensified, and he had never felt more alone. The decision to keep fighting, to not let the inheritance slip from his hands, seemed increasingly difficult. But at the same time, something inside him pushed him forward, a voice that came from no one yet echoed in his mind. "Don't give up now, Santiago. You have a purpose." That night, he couldn't sleep. Conflicting thoughts and emotions clashed in his head. He wondered if he truly deserved everything happening to him. Was he being manipulated by those who claimed to be his allies? Or was he being tested by something greater, something he didn't fully understand? He got out of bed and wandered the empty house, searching for peace in the silence. But the silence felt oppressive, as if the house were waiting for something from him, as if the walls were heavy with the echoes of all the tensions that had built up there. Images of his mother and Don Raimundo surfaced in his mind, and he sat in the old leather armchair, taking a deep breath. What else did he need to discover to feel truly ready? Something was still missing, and he knew he would only find the answer by facing the truth head-on, no matter how painful it was. The next day brought a new confrontation. This time, more direct and intense. Gerardo, accompanied by his lawyers, entered the room where Santiago was seated, his expression even more closed off and threatening. "I know you're trying to act like a legitimate heir, but I won't let that happen," Gerardo said in a low, razor-sharp voice. "You may have the will, but there's one thing you'll never have: the respect of our family. And more importantly, the right to take a place that isn't yours." Santiago felt the pressure in his chest intensify. Gerardo's words had an almost physical effect on him, as if crushing any hope of a peaceful resolution. But he knew he couldn't back down. Not now. The fear of losing what Don Raimundo had left him was far greater than any threat or insult. Deep down, he felt this fight was about something beyond inheritance. He needed to prove to himself that he could be more than just the gardener's son. After the tense encounter, Santiago returned to his room, feeling more exhausted than he ever had before. It was as if the weight of the world were on him, and there was no escape. When he looked out the window, the shadows of the garden, once comforting, now seemed menacing, as if watching his every move. He wanted to feel pride in what he was achieving, but at the same time, part of him feared the cost would be too high. He wondered once again if all of this was just an elaborate lie, a plot he couldn't comprehend. The truth about his origins, about his mother, seemed further away than ever, and he found himself lost in a maze of uncertainty. The only thing he knew for sure was that whatever his destiny, he couldn't let fear paralyze him. He had to act, and act fast, before it was too late. As the inheritance battle raged on, Santiago felt time becoming his enemy. Each day brought new threats, new demands from Don Raimundo's family lawyers, and new reminders of a past he wasn't sure he could accept as truth. With every step, he moved further from the simple man he had once been, and closer to a stranger, someone who had to assume a position of power and make difficult decisions. The pressure mounted, and soon he began questioning how far he was willing to go to keep what had been given to him. He spent sleepless nights, reflecting on what he truly wanted from his life, now that the will was in effect. Did he really want to follow Don Raimundo's legacy and transform the estate into something greater? Or was he being carried by a force he didn't understand? The mere act of becoming the heir seemed to have stripped away a part of his identity, as if he were losing control of his own story. Yet, it was during one of these moments of introspection that he found something resembling an answer, however vague. One of the estate's old employees, a man who worked in Don Raimundo's library, approached Santiago with a letter, yellowed and aged, as if forgotten in the back of a drawer. "I knew you'd need this sooner or later," the man said with a mysterious expression. "Don Raimundo trusted you deeply, but there was something he wanted you to know, something no one else could understand." When opened, the letter revealed something Santiago could never have expected. A confession from Don Raimundo himself about Santiago's true origins. It spoke of a forbidden love, a woman who had worked in the house years ago, one he had fallen for in his youth. Santiago felt a mix of shock and relief as he read those words. After all, it was what he had always suspected, but now it was confirmed beyond doubt. He wasn't just the gardener's son. He was something more, something he still needed to fully understand. The letter left by Don Raimundo didn't just confirm Santiago's suspicions, it offered an explanation he had never imagined. His mother, before being a simple maid, had been a woman of great importance to the old landowner. She came from a noble family, but, due to a scandal in her youth, had been forced into obscurity, moving to Don Raimundo's estate, where she became his secret lover. The weight of the revelation was immense for Santiago. He now knew his connection to that world wasn't just about the affection and trust Don Raimundo had placed in him. There was something deeper, a bloodline tying him to that empire of wealth and power. It made him question the very nature of his struggle. Was he fighting for something that was already his by right? Or was this all about acceptance and belonging? In the days that followed, Santiago made a decision. He would no longer let himself be consumed by doubt and the endless battle with Don Raimundo's family. The letter had opened his eyes to what truly mattered. This wasn't just about inheriting land or riches, it was about honoring his biological father's legacy in a way that felt true to himself. He knew the truth about his origins was more complex than any of those involved wanted to admit, but now he was ready to face the challenges and, more importantly, to claim his place without guilt. While the legal war still raged on, Santiago now felt more prepared. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for Don Raimundo's memory, for the mother he had never known, and for his own identity, which was finally starting to make sense. As the legal battle intensified, Santiago began to notice a change within himself. He was no longer the simple young man who had once worked in the gardens. There was something in him now, a quiet strength driving him to hold his ground despite the threats and schemes. He found support in some of the townspeople who saw his rise as a chance for change. They didn't view him as a usurper, but as someone who could finally bring justice and balance to a family torn apart by greed. But Santiago knew that no matter how much support he had, the challenge ahead was enormous. With every meeting with his lawyers, he felt the pressure mounting. In moments of doubt, he questioned whether it was all worth it. Yet whenever he thought of Don Raimundo's words, whenever he remembered the letter that had revealed the truth, he felt stronger. It didn't matter what others thought. The legacy running through his veins had to be fulfilled. As the legal battle reached its climax, Santiago's real struggle happened within. He spent sleepless nights meditating on what he should do. The part of his soul that still longed for the simplicity and peace of his past clashed with the responsibility he felt as the heir to something far greater than he had ever imagined. He didn't want to be like the other members of Don Raimundo's family, greedy and cruel, but he also knew he couldn't simply abandon the inheritance. What he wanted now was to transform the estate into something that would benefit everyone around him, not just a source of wealth. But the challenges were many, and with each step he felt more overwhelmed. He thought of the letter and the words Don Raimundo had written. This was a responsibility, but also an opportunity. And he knew that to honor the memory of the man who had taken him in, he would have to make difficult choices, even if it meant sacrificing some of his own peace. Time passed, and finally, the day of the verdict arrived. The courtroom was packed, with all members of Don Raimundo's family present, their lawyers, and even some townspeople who had been called to testify in Santiago's favor. The tension in the air was palpable. Santiago, seated beside his own lawyers, felt every family member's gaze weighing on him. Gerardo, his greatest opponent, seemed calmer than ever, perhaps because he believed the outcome was already decided. But Santiago, now stronger than before, stood firm, refusing to buckle under the pressure. He looked at the familiar and unfamiliar faces around him and felt a mix of anger and sadness. What he was about to face was no longer just a legal battle, it was a fight for his identity and everything he now represented. When the judge finally read the verdict, the room fell into absolute silence. The ruling was in Santiago's favor. Don Raimundo's inheritance would remain his, despite the family's claims. But instead of a moment of celebration, the victory tasted bitter. Santiago felt a wave of relief, but also a growing weight, as if the responsibility over his head had become even heavier. He knew Don Raimundo's family would never accept the decision, and the animosity would continue for a long time. Yet he also knew the real victory lay in his ability to resist those who saw him only as the gardener's son. What he needed now was to step away from the disputes, focus on the transformation he wanted for the estate, and ensure Don Raimundo's legacy was preserved as truthfully as possible. But before he could take any step toward the future, Santiago felt the weight of everything he had lost and everything he still had to gain. In the months following the court's decision, Santiago dedicated himself to transforming Don Raimundo's estate. He hired agronomists and local culture experts, restructured the gardens based on the principles the old gardener from his childhood had taught him, and invested in social projects benefiting the region's families. His goal wasn't just to preserve Don Raimundo's legacy, it was to make it a source of good for everyone around him. Every step taken on that land felt like an attempt to reconnect with the past, with the deep roots he still didn't fully understand, but somehow knew were his. While the adversaries from Don Raimundo's family continued to scheme in the shadows, he began to realize his true mission wasn't about defeating others. It was about transforming the place he now called his own. He still felt the weight of doubt, loss, and betrayals, but there was also a sense of redemption in seeing the community thrive under the new initiatives. Yet, despite the progress he made on the estate, something inside Santiago remained unresolved. Once again, he felt an inexplicable longing for the simplicity of the days when he had worked in the gardens beside Alvaro, his adoptive father. Those memories grew more intense, as if he were searching for something that could never be recovered. Walking through the new plantations now, covering the land, Santiago wondered if he was truly on the right path. He had never wanted to be an heir, much less the leader of an empire of land and wealth. But as he looked toward the future, he knew there was no going back. Something deeper was at stake, something that couldn't be resolved by a court ruling or community support alone. Something inside him still needed to be settled. The truth about his mother, about his origins, still loomed like a shadow, and he wondered if he would ever have the full answer, or if, like everything else in his life, this truth would remain something he had to live with without fully understanding. One afternoon, while walking through the gardens, Santiago came across an old tree that Don Raimundo had always tended to personally. It was a sturdy tree with deep roots that seemed to anchor the entire estate. He approached and touched its bark, feeling the rough texture under his fingers. Something about that tree brought him peace, as if Don Raimundo's spirit were there, watching over him and guiding his decisions. For years, that tree had been a symbol to him, but now, touching it, he felt a deeper connection, as if he had finally begun to understand what the old man had wanted from him. It was as if Don Raimundo had known he would need something tangible to find his way, something to bind him to that land and its history. Perhaps this was the first step for Santiago to understand his true mission, and perhaps, just perhaps, he had finally found a way to honor his biological father's legacy in a way that was truer and more his own. As time passed and the estate flourished under Santiago's new initiatives, he noticed the tensions with Don Raimundo's family beginning to fade. The threats became less frequent, and the legal disputes lost momentum. Maybe it was the power of hard work, the transformation he was creating, or maybe it was simply the fact that he was becoming someone the community respected. Either way, Santiago began to realize that Don Raimundo's true legacy wasn't in material wealth, but in the lessons he had taught him, in the deep roots connecting every person to the land. That was the real inheritance Santiago was now ready to carry. As the months went by, he felt the burden of doubt and guilt finally lifting. He felt stronger, more secure in his position, and more capable of making the decisions that would shape the future. Though shadows still lingered in his past, he was finally beginning to accept who he was and what it meant to be Don Raimundo's heir. One morning, Santiago received an unexpected letter. The sender was Gerardo, Don Raimundo's nephew, who had been his main antagonist throughout the legal battle. The letter contained no threats, as he had expected. On the contrary, it was a request for a meeting. Gerardo seemed to have reached a point of remorse, something that deeply surprised Santiago. He knew he couldn't completely trust his relative, but he also understood this. Might be an opportunity to finally close a chapter that had lasted too long. During that meeting, Gerardo revealed something Santiago had never imagined. He too knew about the secret relationship between Don Raimundo and Santiago's mother. Even as the deceased's direct relative, Gerardo felt betrayed for being excluded from the will, yet somehow recognized that Don Raimundo's true legacy wasn't something that could be won with money. He apologized, admitting his quest for revenge and power had blinded him to what truly mattered. Though Santiago felt a pang of discomfort hearing these words, he knew reconciliation, however unlikely, was the necessary next step. In the following days, Santiago pondered deeply about his encounter with Gerardo. He couldn't deny the apology seemed genuine, yet simultaneously felt this reconciliation wouldn't change the past. What troubled him most was that despite all his progress, he still didn't fully understand his mother's role in this complex family. He puzzled. He couldn't stop wondering what else Don Raimundo might have kept hidden. This mystery hung over his life like a shadow that would never fully dissipate. Yet Santiago now understood his true mission wasn't finding all the answers, but learning to live with what he knew and making the best of it. Power, wealth, even the complete truth about his origins seemed to have lost much of their meaning. What truly mattered was what he did with what he had and how he used his position for the community's benefit. In a sense, he was finally beginning to find peace with himself, even as questions about his past continued to arise. With time, Don Raimundo's estate became a model of transformation. Through his quiet but firm leadership, Santiago made the lands flourish again, not just in wealth, but in life. Cultural and agricultural projects began thriving, creating employment and learning opportunities for locals. The vision of a legacy built on generosity and prosperity materialized through collective effort rather than one man's vision. Santiago, once merely the gardener's son, now symbolized a new era for these lands, where hard work and collaboration were valued more than unchecked ambition. Though many still remembered him as the gardener or the gardener's son, there was now a silent reverence in how people treated him. He no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. Even the land itself, with its hills and trees, seemed to honor the change he had brought. Yet, despite the estate's prosperity, Santiago couldn't escape the weight of his own thoughts. At night, when silence filled the house, he would sit alone in his study, contemplating his achievements. He felt a strange emptiness, as if by finally making peace with his inheritance, he had lost something precious in the process. The burden of his choices still haunted him. He regretted nothing, yet felt he'd lost connection with the simplicity he'd valued so much in his early years. Conversations with Alvaro, his adoptive father, had always been moments of wisdom and clarity. Now, though master of everything, he missed something he couldn't name. He longed for those simple days, but knew there was no going back. His chosen path was set. Yet as he gazed at the stars that night, a quiet tranquility settled in his heart, an acceptance that for now at least he was fulfilling his role. Perhaps the true inheritance was precisely this balance between past and future, between wealth and simplicity. The estate's transformation wasn't just about material wealth. It represented a profound change in Santiago's relationship with the community. Over time, he earned everyone's respect and admiration, not just as Don Raimundo's heir, but as someone who genuinely cared for their well-being. He became involved in local matters, from children's education to supporting small businesses. His presence, once viewed with suspicion, now symbolized progress. However, not everyone welcomed the new Santiago. Some of Gerardo's old allies, who still hadn't accepted defeat, continued making venomous remarks in the shadows. They still saw him as a usurper, an outsider unworthy of this world of wealth and power. Santiago knew this, but learned to ignore these voices. All he wanted now was to make a difference where he lived, and perhaps someday be remembered as someone who did good, not just as the gardener's son. On a sunny afternoon, while walking through the gardens, Santiago was approached by an unexpected figure, Gerardo. The man seemed calmer, more introspective than during their last meeting. He approached with a serious but not hostile expression. "I know our disputes will never truly end, but I came to say I was wrong," Gerardo said, his voice heavy with regret. Santiago studied him silently, feeling a strange mix of emotions. Part of him felt relieved to hear Gerardo's words, yet he knew the betrayals and damage were already done. It no longer mattered whether Gerardo regretted his actions. The harm couldn't be undone. Still, Santiago recognized this gesture of reconciliation was necessary somehow. He took a deep breath and after a long silence replied, "It's too late to fix what happened, but perhaps we can start writing a new chapter for all of us." He didn't know whether this conversation meant something profound or was just another formality. But for now, the response was enough. He was ready to move forward. Time passed, and Santiago's life continued. Peacefully, focused on the projects he'd initiated. With each new endeavor, he felt more connected to the land and the legacy Don Raimundo had left him, yet also more distant from his own history. He knew that despite having transformed into a man of power and influence, part of him remained the boy who spent hours in the gardens listening to Alvaro's stories. Sometimes, when the wind rustled the trees and he closed his eyes, he could still hear his adoptive father's voice guiding him through difficult times. It was a sense of belonging that stayed with him, yet also made him wonder, who was he really? The legitimate heir of Don Raimundo, or simply a simple man's son who'd by chance crossed paths with nobility? These questions never fully disappeared, but Santiago learned to live with them. He understood that what mattered wasn't the past, but what he did in the present. On a cloudy day, while walking through the mansion's corridors, Santiago encountered an unexpected figure, a stately woman with penetrating eyes. She introduced herself as an old friend of his mother's, someone who knew his family history well and felt the time had come to reveal the truth. "You know enough to understand, but the puzzle's final piece is missing," she said in a low, grave voice. Santiago regarded her suspiciously, yet curiosity compelled him forward. She led him to a secluded room where she revealed an aged wooden box. Inside were old letters and photographs, many of his mother that he'd never seen before. The letters spoke of love and suffering, of a woman who'd long carried a painful secret. The revelation struck him silently but powerfully. Santiago felt everything he believed about himself was about to change once more. He needed time to process this, but one thing became clear. The truth, however difficult, was the only thing that could finally set him free. The contents of the letterbox left Santiago deeply shaken. He spent hours poring over pages that gave him insights he'd never imagined. What surprised him most was discovering his mother had been a strong, resilient woman, yet also one marked by loneliness and sacrifices made for love. The secret she'd kept her entire life was more complex than he could immediately comprehend. There were references to a relationship with Don Raimundo, but never explicit. It was as if she'd done everything possible to hide the truth, even from herself. Santiago was left with the feeling that throughout his life, he'd never truly known who his mother had been before becoming his mother. His chest tightened painfully, as if by discovering more about her, he was somehow losing the connection to his childhood. Yet simultaneously, he felt gratitude for finally understanding her story and connecting with a deeper part of his identity. As he reflected on the letters, the truth he'd sought so long became clearer yet more painful. He wasn't just Don Raimundo's heir. He was, in fact, part of this family's history, a story that couldn't be erased, no matter how hard he tried. Don Raimundo's decision to leave him the inheritance had been, in a way, an attempt at reparation, making amends for past mistakes. Yet learning his true origins made him wonder, what did it all really mean? The inheritance, the power, the legacy, all seemed less important compared to what he'd lost along the way. He knew that ultimately the greatest legacy he could leave was the positive impact he made on others' lives. The estate might be his, but it was the community that truly enriched him. And though the truth about his mother left him with more questions than answers, he knew that by embracing his true identity, he was also embracing what truly mattered, the legacy of kindness and generosity he'd chosen to build. In the following days, Santiago immersed himself completely in remaining tasks, as if the weight of truth fueled his determination. He continued transforming Don Raimundo's estate, investing in new crops, creating agricultural education programs, expanding employment opportunities for locals. His outlook on life had changed in ways he couldn't fully explain. He felt more focused, calmer, as if acceptance had somehow lightened the burden of the past. Simultaneously, his connection with his mother, which had always seemed distant and vague, gained new meaning. He began understanding what she'd done for him and how much she'd sacrificed to give him a better life. The love she'd given him, though, silent and wordless, now seemed clearer than ever. Deep in his heart, he knew he couldn't let past pain define the future. But as always happens, the shadows of the past don't disappear so easily. Even as Santiago moved forward, some still regarded him with suspicion, particularly those who'd never accepted him as part of that family. The resistance he faced came not just from outsiders, but from his own mind. During loneliest nights, he questioned whether he truly belonged in this new life. Fear of rejection, betrayal, and loneliness crept into his thoughts. Despite all his progress, the ghost of doubt always followed him. Yet something within him had changed. He was no longer chasing an imposed identity. He'd chosen to become the man he wanted to be, and this made him stronger each day. He knew Don Raimundo's legacy, the true inheritance he needed to honor, was the ability to face adversity while remaining true to himself, even when the world proved harsh and relentless. Winter arrived suddenly, bringing not just weather changes, but a quiet transformation in Santiago's life. During this time, he reflected on everything he'd experienced and learned. He no longer saw himself as just the simple gardener's son, nor as Don Raimundo's legitimate heir. Now he saw someone who'd finally found his own purpose. Snow covered the fields, and the garden that had always been his home stood quiet and undisturbed. Yet inside him, something bloomed. He knew deep down that what truly mattered wasn't inheritances or material possessions, but the impact he made on those who depended on him. He now saw himself as guardian of the land and his father's memory, a man who, despite all adversities, had built something lasting and meaningful. Walking the snow-covered garden paths, he felt at peace with all that had happened. One night, after an especially long day, Santiago received an unexpected visitor. Gerardo appeared at his door again, but now without the anger and arrogance that had marked their early encounters. He looked older, wearier, and his words were more sincere than ever. I don't really know what to say," Gerardo began, his voice trembling. "I spent so long hating you, not realizing I was only sinking deeper. I owed you an apology, and perhaps more than that. I wanted you to know that somehow I'm trying to change, to be better." Santiago, surprised, studied him silently. He'd never imagined hearing such words from Gerardo, but looking at the man, he realized that, like himself, Gerardo was trying to find his own path. "We all have our mistakes," Santiago replied with a calm that surprised even him. "What matters now is what we do with them." Forgiveness didn't come easily for Gerardo, but Santiago was willing to move forward. He knew life consisted not just of victories, but losses and difficult choices too. Gerardo began working with him, assisting with some farm initiatives, and though their relationship would never be easy, something between them shifted. Santiago realized his most valuable possessions weren't material things, but the people around him, those who, despite their mistakes, were willing to change. Feeling embraced by a community that finally accepted his leadership role strengthened him in ways he'd never imagined. With this, Don Raimundo's legacy, with all its complexities and errors, seemed complete. Santiago knew that by moving forward, he was creating something more important, a foundation of compassion, understanding, and above all, redemption. Meanwhile, the ghosts of the past finally began fading. Tensions with Don Raimundo's family lessened over time, especially after Gerardo and his relatives' last failed attempt to contest the inheritance. What had once been a constant struggle for power and money now seemed irrelevant compared to the tranquility Santiago had found. He'd become something he never imagined, a man respected not for his wealth, but for his ability to forgive, learn from mistakes, and remain steadfast despite adversity. Looking back, he saw he'd overcome what once seemed impossible. He was, at last, Don Raimundo's heir, but also someone who'd carved his own path, one that only he could follow. In recent months, the farm had transformed in ways Santiago never expected. Work that once felt like obligation now symbolized what he truly represented. He saw the land not as property, but as reflecting his own journey. With each new crop, each community partnership, he felt he was building something greater than himself. As years passed, he continued honoring Don Raimundo's memory, not as a rich landowner's heir, but as a man who knew how to transform pain and loneliness into something positive for others. With every decision, Santiago remembered life's lessons, and his name, once associated only with the gardener's son, now became synonymous with compassion and resilience. One serene evening as winter gave way to spring, Santiago sat by the garden's edge, watching plants that had grown under his care, symbols of his own evolution. Something within him was at peace, as if everything had finally fallen into place. He knew he'd never fully understand Don Raimundo's choices or the complexities of his inheritance, but he'd done what he could. He'd created a life in his own image, and that was enough. This was no longer about fighting for what was owed, but reconciling with what he truly needed: acceptance of his history, forgiveness for his mistakes, and above all, recognition that the greatest legacy was giving others the chance to start anew, just as he had done himself. In the end, what Santiago learned was that true inheritance isn't received, but built over time through choices made and lives touched. Don Raimundo's estate continued thriving not because wealth mattered, but because the land reflected what he'd become, a place of welcome, healing, and renewal. He knew Don Raimundo's legacy, with all its mistakes and secrets, had transformed into something he could carry with pride, because he'd renewed it. As time passed, Santiago's name came to represent something greater than material inheritance. He became a symbol of a new generation that understood the importance of what one does with what one has, not what one is given. And so, as winter's last day yielded to spring, Santiago, the gardener's son, finally understood what it meant to be free. Free not just from the past's chains, but from needing approval or recognition. He'd liberated himself not by winning, but by realizing that to truly inherit something, one must first understand what life, with all its ups and downs, has to offer. With this, he bid farewell to uncertainty and doubt, because in the end, he'd somehow known all along that the greatest inheritance lies in living courageously, making peace with the unchangeable, and always moving forward.